On May 2, 1968, in the jungles of Vietnam near the Cambodian border, a 33-year-old Green Beret named Roy Benavidez heard a desperate radio call. A 12-man Special Forces team was surrounded by a North Vietnamese Army battalion of roughly 1,000 soldiers. They were being slaughtered. Helicopter gunships and Air Force jets had tried to help but couldn't get close enough. The team was calling for emergency extraction, but it seemed like a suicide mission. Roy Benavidez had already completed his tour of duty that day. He was at the forward operating base, working administrative duties. He could have ignored the call. Nobody would have blamed him. But when he heard those voices on the radio, heard American soldiers dying in the jungle, he couldn't stay put. He grabbed his medical bag and a knife, jumped aboard a rescue helicopter that was preparing to make an extraction attempt, and flew into hell. Over the next 6 hours, Benavidez would be shot multiple times, bayoneted, hit with grenade shrapnel, and clubbed with a rifle butt. He would save 8 men's lives. He would refuse to die even when everyone, including doctors, thought he was dead. This is the story of the toughest man you've never heard of, a Mexican-American kid from Texas who became one of the most decorated soldiers in American history, a man who literally spit in death's face. Roy Benavidez was born on August 5, 1935, near Cuero, Texas, a small town about 90 miles southeast of San Antonio. His parents were Yaqui Indian and Mexican descent, poor farm workers who struggled to survive in Depression-era Texas. Roy's father died of tuberculosis when Roy was 2 years old. His mother died when he was 7. Roy and his younger brother Roger were sent to live with their uncle and aunt Salvador and Alexandria Benavidez, who raised them on a farm. Life was hard. The family was poor, living in a 2-room shack without electricity or running water. Roy and Roger worked in the cotton fields and sugar beet fields from an early age, picking crops alongside adults for pennies. Roy attended school but faced discrimination as a Mexican-American child in 1940s Texas. Teachers often treated Hispanic students as second class. Roy struggled with reading and eventually dropped out of school in 7th grade to work full-time and help support his family. As a teenager, Roy worked wherever he could find labor, picking cotton, working construction, doing whatever was necessary. He was short, just 5 feet 6 inches tall, stocky and strong from years of farm labor. He had a quiet demeanor, but a fierce determination. Life had taught him to be tough, to push through pain and hardship, to never quit no matter how hard things got. In 1952, at age 17, Roy enlisted in the Texas Army National Guard. He saw the military as a way out of poverty, a chance to earn steady pay and maybe learn a trade. In 1955, he joined the regular army and was sent to Korea. Though the Korean War had ended by then, he served as an infantryman, learned army discipline and tactics, and found that he was good at military life. The army offered Roy something he had never had before: respect. In the military, his ethnic background mattered less than his competence and determination. He could advance based on merit. He took the army seriously, trained hard, and proved himself capable. In 1959, Roy married his wife Hilaria, called Lala, and started a family. He seemed on track for a solid, if unremarkable, military career. Then, in 1965, he volunteered for Vietnam. His first tour was with the 82nd Airborne Division. It nearly ended his military career permanently. In May 1965, while on patrol near Saigon, Roy stepped on a landmine. The explosion threw him through the air and left him with severe wounds to his back and legs. Shrapnel tore through his body. Doctors told him he would never walk again. They said his spine was damaged beyond repair and he should prepare for life in a wheelchair. Roy Benavidez heard those words and decided they were wrong. While recovering in an army hospital, he began a self-directed rehabilitation program that doctors thought was impossible. Every night, when the nurses weren't watching, he would drag himself out of bed, using his arms, and try to move his legs. The pain was excruciating. He couldn't feel his legs properly, couldn't control them, but he kept trying. For months, he worked in secret, pushing his body beyond what medical science said was possible. Slowly, impossibly, he regained feeling in his legs. He progressed from dragging himself across the floor to standing with support to taking a few steps. After nearly a year of rehabilitation, Roy Benavidez walked out of the hospital under his own power. Doctors called it a miracle. But Roy wasn't satisfied with just walking. He wanted to return to combat. He applied for Special Forces training, the elite Green Berets. Most soldiers who had been injured as severely as Roy would never have been considered. But Roy's recovery had been so complete that he was accepted. Green Beret training was brutal. Long marches with heavy packs, survival training, weapons training, airborne training, hand-to-hand combat, and extensive medical training. Roy was older than most trainees, in his early 30s, and still carrying shrapnel in his body from the landmine. But he refused to quit. He finished the training and earned his Green Beret. In 1968, Roy volunteered for a second tour in Vietnam, this time as a Special Forces advisor with Studies and Observations Group, or SOG. SOG units conducted highly classified missions deep inside enemy territory in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. These were extremely dangerous assignments with high casualty rates. Roy volunteered because that's what Green Berets did. They went to the most dangerous places and did the hardest jobs. Which brings us to May 2nd, 1968, and the day Roy Benavidez earned his place in military history. The mission that day was a reconnaissance patrol by a 12-man SOG team deep inside Cambodia, across the border from South Vietnam. The team, call sign Tango Mike Mike, had been inserted by helicopter to gather intelligence on North Vietnamese army movements. But shortly after landing, they walked into a North Vietnamese battalion. The NVA force was estimated at around 1,000 soldiers. The 12 Americans and South Vietnamese allies were immediately surrounded. A massive firefight erupted. Within minutes, several team members were wounded or killed. The team called for emergency extraction, but North Vietnamese fire was so intense that rescue helicopters couldn't get close. 2 helicopter gunships trying to provide cover were shot down. The situation was desperate. The team was running out of ammunition, had multiple casualties, and was being overrun. Their radio transmissions became increasingly frantic. They needed help immediately, or they would all die. Roy Benavidez was at FOB Loc Ninh when the radio calls came in. He was working as part of the standby reaction force, but he had already flown 1 mission that morning and wasn't scheduled for more duty that day. When he heard the desperate calls from Tango, Mike, he didn't hesitate. He ran to the helicopter that was preparing to make another extraction attempt. The helicopter pilot looked at Roy and the few other volunteers and told them honestly this was probably a one-way trip. The landing zone was too hot, the enemy fire too intense. They probably wouldn't make it out. Roy nodded and climbed aboard anyway. He grabbed his medical bag and a combat knife. In his rush, he didn't bring a rifle, only his knife and a small pistol. The helicopter flew toward the battle. As they approached, they could see smoke rising from the jungle, hear the gunfire even over the helicopter's engines. The pilot tried to land, but intense enemy fire drove him back. He tried again from a different angle. Again, the fire was too heavy. On the third attempt, the pilot managed to hover just above the jungle canopy, about 10 feet off the ground. Roy Benavidez jumped out of the helicopter into the jungle. He landed hard, nearly 75 yards from where the Soji team was pinned down. Immediately, North Vietnamese soldiers began shooting at him. Bullets snapped through the jungle. Roy started running toward the team's position, zigzagging through the trees. Within moments, he was shot. A bullet hit his leg. The pain was intense, but Roy kept running. He was hit again, this time in the face, the bullet passing through his jaw. Blood poured into his mouth, but he kept moving. He reached the SOG team's perimeter and dove into their defensive position. What Roy found was carnage. 4 men were already dead. The others were wounded, some critically. They were nearly out of ammunition. North Vietnamese soldiers were closing in from all sides, sometimes getting within a few meters before being driven back by the last bursts of gunfire from the Americans. Roy immediately began organizing a defense and treating the wounded. Despite being shot twice himself, he moved from man to man, providing medical care, redistributing ammunition, calling in airstrikes on enemy positions. He used the radio to guide helicopter gunships and Air Force jets to targets around their perimeter. For the next several hours, Roy held the defensive position together through sheer force of will. He was shot again and again. Grenade fragments tore into his arms and back. At one point, a North Vietnamese soldier rushed him with a bayonet and stabbed him in the back. Roy killed the soldier with his knife, pulled the bayonet out of his own body, and kept fighting. The scene was chaos. Enemy soldiers swarmed the position. Roy moved constantly, firing captured enemy weapons because he had no rifle of his own, throwing grenades, providing medical care to wounded men, calling in air support. He was bleeding from multiple wounds, but refused to stop. Finally, after hours of fighting, a helicopter managed to get close enough to attempt extraction. Roy began dragging and carrying the wounded men to the helicopter. Some could walk with assistance. Others had to be carried. Roy moved each man through enemy fire, making multiple trips back and forth. He loaded the dead and wounded onto the helicopter. North Vietnamese soldiers continued firing. Roy was hit multiple times while loading men. He kept working. As the last wounded man was loaded, Roy made one final trip back into the kill zone to retrieve classified documents and the SOG team's radio. He couldn't let sensitive information fall into enemy hands. On his way back to the helicopter, Roy was hit by a grenade blast. Shrapnel tore into his back and head. He fell but got up and kept moving. He reached the helicopter and climbed aboard just as the pilot lifted off. North Vietnamese soldiers rushed the aircraft, firing point blank. Roy grabbed an M60 machine gun and returned fire, covering the helicopter's escape even as he bled heavily. The helicopter cleared the tree line and headed back to base. Roy had saved 8 men. He had killed multiple enemy soldiers. He had been shot at least 7 times, hit with grenade shrapnel, bayoneted, and clubbed. His intestines were exposed from wounds. Blood covered his entire body. When the helicopter landed at the FOB, Roy tried to walk off under his own power, but collapsed. Medics rushed to him. A doctor examined him briefly, then covered his body with a poncho. The doctor thought Roy was dead. Roy Benavidez lay there under the poncho, unable to move or speak but still conscious. He heard the doctor pronounce him dead. He felt someone zipping him into a body bag. In that moment, Roy decided he wasn't finished yet. Using every bit of remaining strength, he worked up enough saliva in his mouth and spit it in the doctor's face. The doctor jumped back in shock. Roy was immediately rushed to surgery. The medical team worked on him for hours. The injuries were staggering. He had been shot 7 times, including through both legs, both arms, his face, his head, and his back. He had over 30 fragmentation wounds from grenades. He had been bayoneted. A rifle butt had fractured his skull. His intestines were hanging out of his body. He had lost enormous amounts of blood. Doctors didn't think he would survive the night. But Roy Benavidez, the man who had been told he would never walk again and then walked anyway, wasn't done yet. He survived the surgery. Then he survived the night. Then he survived the next day and the next. His recovery was long and agonizing. He spent months in hospitals, undergoing multiple surgeries. The wounds to his back and abdomen were particularly serious. Doctors removed shrapnel but couldn't get it all. Roy would carry pieces of metal in his body for the rest of his life. Eventually, impossibly, he recovered enough to return to duty. He served with Special Forces for several more years before retiring from the Army in 1976 with the rank of Master Sergeant. He had served for 24 years. During his military career, Roy received numerous decorations, including the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on May 2, 1968. But there was a problem with that award. The Distinguished Service Cross is the second highest military decoration, but Roy's actions clearly warranted the Medal of Honor, America's highest award for valor. The issue was documentation. In the chaos of combat, there hadn't been an officer present to witness and document Roy's actions in the detail required for a Medal of Honor. For years, Roy's fellow soldiers tried to get his award upgraded, but the paperwork requirements seemed insurmountable. Then, in the early 1980s, the helicopter pilot and other witnesses came forward with detailed statements. Brian O'Connor, one of the men Roy saved, led the effort to get Roy the recognition he deserved. After years of work, the recommendation finally made it through the military bureaucracy. On February 24, 1981, President Ronald Reagan presented Roy Benavidez with the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the Pentagon. 13 years after the battle, Roy finally received the nation's highest military decoration. Reagan called Roy's actions a legendary act of courage. In his acceptance speech, Roy was characteristically humble. He dedicated the medal to all the men who served in Special Forces. particularly those who didn't come home. He said he was just a soldier doing his duty, nothing more. But everyone who heard the citation read aloud knew better. Roy Benavidez had performed one of the most remarkable acts of courage in American military history. After receiving the Medal of Honor, Roy became a motivational speaker. He traveled the country talking to military units, schools, and civic groups. His message was simple: never quit, never give up, and always look out for your fellow soldiers. He spoke about the importance of courage, not just physical courage in combat, but moral courage in everyday life. Roy was particularly committed to speaking to young Hispanic Americans. He wanted them to know that someone who looked like them, who came from poverty like many of them, could achieve great things through determination and hard work. He became a role model for an entire generation of Mexican-American youth. He also became an advocate for Medal of Honor recipients and veterans' issues. He worked with veterans organizations, testified before Congress about veterans' benefits, and made sure that the sacrifices of Vietnam veterans were not forgotten. Vietnam veterans had often been treated poorly when they returned home, and Roy worked to change that narrative. Roy wrote a memoir titled Medal of Honor: One Man's Journey from Poverty and Prejudice, published in 1995. The book detailed his difficult childhood, his military career, and his philosophy of life. It became a bestseller and introduced his story to a wider audience. Despite his fame and decorations, Roy remained remarkably humble. Friends and family described him as kind, funny, and down-to-earth. He never boasted about his actions or acted like he was special. He was the same Roy who had grown up picking cotton in Texas, just older and with more scars. But the scars weren't just physical. Like many combat veterans, Roy struggled with the psychological aftermath of war. He had nightmares about Vietnam. He dealt with survivor's guilt, wondering why he survived when so many others died. He carried the weight of every man he couldn't save, every friend who didn't come home. In later years, Roy developed serious health problems related to his combat injuries and exposure to Agent Orange in Vietnam. He had diabetes and respiratory issues. The shrapnel still in his body caused chronic pain, but he rarely complained. He had survived things that should have killed him multiple times. A little pain wasn't going to stop him. On November 29, 1998, Roy Benavidez died at the age of 63 from complications related to diabetes. He was buried with full military honors at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in San Antonio, Texas. Hundreds of people attended his funeral, including many of the men he had served with and saved. Roy Benavidez left behind his wife Lala, 3 children, and a legacy of courage that continues to inspire. The U.S. Navy named a ship after him, the USNS Benavidez. Schools and buildings across the country bear his name. His story is taught in military training as an example of valor and determination. But perhaps his most important legacy is the example he set. Roy showed that heroism isn't about being superhuman. It's about refusing to quit when quitting would be easier. It's about putting others before yourself. It's about doing your duty even when you're terrified, even when you're wounded, even when death seems certain. Roy Benavidez was shot 37 times in one day. He was bayoneted, hit with grenades, and left for dead. He spit in death's face and lived to tell about it. But more than surviving, he lived with purpose, dignity, and humility. He never forgot where he came from or the men who fought beside him. The poor Mexican-American kid from Texas who was told he'd never walk again walked straight into hell to save his brothers. And when hell tried to keep him, he fought his way back out. That's the story of Roy Benavidez, one of America's greatest heroes, a man who proved that true courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. Roy's favorite saying was simple but powerful. "I don't like to be called a hero. The real heroes are the ones who gave their lives for their country. I was just lucky to come home." That humility, that refusal to put himself above others, was perhaps the most admirable thing about him. He had done the impossible, survived the unsurvivable, but he never let it go to his head. Today, when people hear Roy Benavidez's story for the first time, they often don't believe it. It sounds too incredible, too much like a Hollywood movie. But every detail is documented, every witness statement verified. Roy Benavidez really did jump into a battle to save men he barely knew. He really was shot, bayoneted, and left for dead. He really did spit blood to prove he was still alive. He really did survive and go on to live a full life. His story reminds us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Roy wasn't born special. He didn't have superpowers. He was just a poor kid from Texas who decided to never give up, no matter what. That determination, forged in the cotton fields and tested in the jungles of Vietnam, made him legendary. The question people always ask is, how did he do it? How did Roy Benavidez survive wounds that should have killed him multiple times? The answer isn't complicated. He refused to die. When his body wanted to quit, his mind wouldn't let it. When the pain became unbearable, he bore it anyway. When death seemed certain, he decided it wasn't his time yet. But it wasn't just stubbornness. It was love. Love for his fellow soldiers, the men who were depending on him. Love for his family back home, who needed him. Love for his country, which he had sworn to defend. That love gave him strength when his body had none left. Roy Benavidez proved that the human spirit is capable of incredible things when properly motivated. He showed that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. He demonstrated that one person, armed with determination and purpose, can make an impossible difference. His life was a journey from poverty to heroism, from being told what he couldn't do to proving everyone wrong. He walked when doctors said he never would. He survived when everyone thought he was dead. He thrived when the odds were stacked against him. Most importantly, he never forgot where he came from or who he was fighting for. Roy Benavidez remained Roy Benavidez. The humble kid from Cuero, Texas, even after becoming one of America's most decorated soldiers. That authenticity, that groundedness, made him not just a hero, but a role model. When you visit Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery and stand at Roy Benavidez's grave, you'll often find fresh flowers and military challenge coins left by visitors. Veterans come to pay their respects. Young soldiers come to be inspired. Families come to teach their children about courage and sacrifice. His story lives on, inspiring new generations to be brave, to never quit, and to always take care of each other. Roy Benavidez was shot 37 times in one day and survived. But that's just the beginning of his story. He survived to show us all what true courage looks like, what real heroism means, and what one determined person can accomplish against impossible odds. He lived the American dream, not through wealth or fame, but through service, sacrifice, and an unbreakable spirit. That's why his story matters. That's why we remember Roy Benavidez.